The noon sun poured over dust water in a parched yellow light, stretching the shadows of squat wooden buildings as if they might melt into the desert dust. The sound of wagon wheels had already faded, leaving behind an empty road where a tumbleweed rolled and spun with the wind. Amara Johnson stood with her small hand carried, watching until the last swirl of dust settled, then let out a slow breath. She had missed the coach, the only one that day bound for Double Star Ranch, where a distant relative had promised her work at a sewing room. Amara drew her shawl tighter about her shoulders. Beneath it was a worn brown dress. Its fabric faded by time. She knew she stood out in the way Dustwater wished she wouldn't. Dark skin, a slim but proud frame, eyes too direct for folks to pretend not to see. The main street was narrow, lined with a general store, a saloon, and a pine-built church, all breathing in the same weary rhythm, one that said strangers weren't welcome here. When Amara stepped into the boarding house, the woman at the desk glanced her up and down, lips pressed thin. "No rooms," the woman said flatly, though a sign on the door clearly read vacancy. Amara swallowed her sigh, murmured thanks, and stepped back out. Her shoes left shallow prints in the dusty ground, a fading line of questions no one cared to answer. From the cafe next door drifted the smell of cornbread, sharp enough to tighten her empty stomach. She hesitated, then pushed inside. Light slanted through the windows, falling across a few cowhands hunched over beer mugs, muttering low. When she reached the counter, the girl serving, blonde, eyes vacant, stiffened. "We don't serve here," the girl said, her voice soft, but cutting like a cold blade driven straight down. The air went heavy. Men at nearby tables looked up, one with a smirk, another turning away. Amara stood tall, fingers locked around her handle. Her throat was dry, but no tears came. She had known looks like these from Kansas clear to here. Still the emptiness dug deep like a hollow pit in her chest. Then a slow movement in the back caught her eye. A man sat against the wall, wide-brimmed hat shadowing half his face. He said nothing, only looked at her. Steel-cold eyes in the dim light, steady, cutting through any mask she might raise. That gaze carried no contempt, no pity. It only saw. A long look heavy as 1,000 words. Amara's heart tightened. For the first time since stepping into Dustwater, she did not feel entirely cast out. And that more than the scorn frightened her. Frightened her that the calm could vanish just as quickly. The man pushed his hat back, revealing gray-flecked hair, a sun-worn face etched with time. He was near 40, shoulders broad, hands like stone resting quiet on the table. Before him sat a cup of coffee gone cold, no steam rising, a slight nod, nothing more. Amara faltered, unsure how to answer until a whisper rose behind her. "Boone," one of the cowhands muttered low as a warning. The name shifted the air. The waitress drifted away. The men bent their heads, silence sealing the room. Amara studied herself. She knew little of Boone, only what she'd overheard on the coach. Isaiah Boone, a recluse at the town's edge, a man who'd lost wife and child in an accident. Some said he'd gone mad, others that he was dangerous. But in that one glance they shared, she felt no threat. Only a silent darkness she knew well enough to recognize her own reflection in it. She turned and walked out, keeping her back straight. Still, when the saloon door closed behind, her heart thudded loud in her chest. Outside, the afternoon wind bit colder. She pulled her shawl close and found a wooden step to rest on. Passers-by glanced at her like she was no more than a shadow. The weight of being turned from tables, from roofs, from simple kindness pressed down, threatening to crush. She told herself, this night will pass. Tomorrow there'll be another coach. Just one more day to endure. But as dusk fell and shadows stretched, unease clawed deeper. She did not know where she might sleep, and the old fear returned, the fear of wandering in a strange town with nowhere to belong. Heavy footsteps struck the ground. Amara lifted her eyes. The man from the cafe, Isaiah Boone, was striding toward her, his figure long in the dust. He stopped before her, eyes steady, voice low and rough, like dry wood grinding together. "No one here will give you shelter. Come with me. Amara's grip tightened on her. For a breath their eyes met again, and in the silence lay an unspoken promise. He would not leave her adrift. That look, weighty and calm, eased the storm in her chest. She nodded and rose. Walking beside him, she listened to the firm rhythm of his boots on the hard ground. Night wind carried the faint smoke of cabins in the distance. In that quiet, Amara understood. Missing that stagecoach was not the end, but perhaps the very turn where something new began. Isaiah Boone's cabin stood apart on the edge of Dustwater, its back pressed against a rough ridge, its front facing a patch of meadow where streaks of snow still lingered. When the wooden door swung open, the scent of old pine and wood smoke rushed out. Amara stepped inside, the warmth from the hearth sweeping across her face, melting away what chills still clung from the afternoon. The place was small. A single open room with a fireplace, a rough unit table, shelves lined with tin boxes, and a scatter of smithing tools. Everything was neat, but it carried the feel of a house long untouched by a woman's hand. Isaiah set his broad-brimmed hat on the shelf. He said nothing, only gave a short nod toward the long bench before the fire. Amara understood. He was offering her a place for the night. The bench was narrow, but enough for her to curl upon. Beside it sat a tidy stack of folded blankets, surprisingly clean. Isaiah bent to lift one. His movement slow but steady. When he laid it down, his hand trembled faintly, as if the touch pulled forward a memory still sharp. Amara lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing the crisp fold. A strange tide rose in her chest. Gratitude mingled with the heaviness of solitude that soaked through the room. Her eyes caught on the shelf. A framed photograph, old and dark, sat tilted. In it, a young woman with braided hair rested in a rocking chair. A child of 4 on her lap. Their faces shone with light in stark contrast to the silence around her now. The rocker itself remained in the corner, empty, worn, swaying just slightly with the draft that slipped through the cracks. Amara clutched her valise tighter. She knew she ought not stare, yet the ache came anyway, the ache of a home stripped of its soul. A sound made her turn. Isaiah was pouring hot water into a chipped porcelain cup. He brought it to her, holding it steady. When she reached out, their fingertips brushed. A fleeting contact, but sharp as a spark down her spine. Amara looked up and found his ash-gray eyes. No words, only a gaze long and quiet, holding and searching both. The moment stretched until even the crackle of the fire seemed to fade. She dropped her eyes, gripping the cup. The heat spread through her palms, steadying the tremor, but setting her heart to pound faster. Isaiah lingered a moment, then turned back to the table. He lowered himself into the chair, head bowed into his broad hands. Silence returned to the cabin. Amara sipped. A hint of mint, sharp with pine, slid down her throat. Warmth spread, though her heart grew heavier. She knew she was only passing through, that tomorrow's stagecoach would take her onward. Yet his quiet kindness, offered without words, felt like laying down a burden she had carried far too long. Night settled slow. Amara spread the blanket and curled on the bench. Firelight threw her shadow small against the wide wall. Her eyes drifted shut, but before sleep claimed her, she heard a chair scrape lightly, then a deep sigh, drawn from the farthest reaches of a man's chest. She did not turn, but in the dark, a faint smile crossed her lips. For the first time in many days, she felt she was not entirely alone. On her first morning in Dustwater, Amara awoke to thin daylight slipping through the cabin's small window. The hearth had gone cold, the room damp and chill. Yet the lingering scent of burnt wood steadied her more than the darkness of the night before. Isaiah was gone, leaving only fresh mud tracks on the floorboards, and the echo of the door closing hard behind him. She splashed her face with cold water, bound her braids tight at the nape of her neck. She decided she would not sit idle. In a town like this, no work meant no survival. So that morning she made her way to the little wooden church where the pastor's wife was known to need help mending children's robes. The old woman's eyes were weary but not unkind. When Amara offered her hands, she nodded, passing a pile of worn cloth and a dulled needle. If you've got patience, there's always work here, she said. As Amara sewed, whispers stirred nearby. That girl staying out at Boone's place. They say he once had a fine wife and a young boy, too. Both lost in a wagon wreck years back. He's been living like a shadow ever since. Folks say he still blames himself. The needle stilled in Amara's fingers, thread trembling, her chest tightened. The image of that tilted photograph of the empty rocker in the corner of his cabin rose sharp in her mind. She understood then why his gaze carried such depth, as though he stared out from the edge of a pit too steep to climb. By evening she returned to the cabin with a few cornbread cakes the pastor's wife had pressed into her hands. Isaiah was in the yard splitting logs. His broad shoulders bent low, the axe rising and falling steady, each strike breaking wood as if he drove his sorrow into the grain. Amara set her bag down and stepped into the small kitchen. She lit a fire, set beans to stew, and laid out the cornbread. Her movements were clumsy, but soon the air filled with warmth and the smell of food. Isaiah came in, sweat beading on his brow. He stopped, eyes on the rising steam. For a moment, she feared he would dismiss it, but instead he gave a single nod and hung the axe on its hook. They ate in silence. Amara felt awkward, yet when she glanced up, she caught the faintest lift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something eased. It was enough to soften her heart. The next day, she set to cleaning. Dust lifted from the shelves, windows cleared to let in light, blankets scrubbed and hung out to dry. Slowly, the cabin breathed again, no longer wholly cold. Isaiah said little, but change flickered in his eyes. When she spilled a cup of water, he bent to help, his hand brushing hers. The touch lingered a heartbeat longer than before. The warmth of it stayed even after the scent of smoke had faded. That evening, as Amara pinned cloth to dry on the porch rail, Isaiah paused beside her. He kept his gaze fixed on the distant meadow, voice growly as if unused to speech. "Thank you for supper." Amara turned. For a fleeting instant, she saw it. The curve of a smile, fragile as breath, gone as soon as it appeared. Yet, it was real, and it told her she was no longer just a guest under his roof. Night came. By the fire, Amara stitched a child's robe for the church. The flames painted her face, her dark eyes lit with steady light. Isaiah sat at the table, silent but no longer apart. The sound of needle through cloth, the pop of wood in the hearth together formed a rhythm, slow but shaping into something like life. Inside her gratitude and sorrow wove together, she had never thought a fleeting smile could warm a house so long steeped in cold. Rumors traveled quicker than any wind across the dust-water plain. Within days of Amara stepping into the cabin at the town's edge, whispers had spread everywhere. In the general store, along the pews of the church, even at the public well. Folks spoke plain without shame. The Negro woman living with Boone. No wedding, no vows, just moved right in. Disgraceful. Boone's gone mad since his wife and boy died. Each fragment cut across Amara's skin like a blade. One morning, carrying cloth to the pastor's wife, she caught two women murmuring in the hall. "Pitiful, isn't it? Boone must be that starved for a woman's touch. And of all choices, he takes a black one." Her throat closed tight. She lowered her head, hurried her steps, afraid they might see tears in her eyes. Her hand clenched the cloth until her knuckles widened. She had borne stares and slurs all through Kansas. Yet she had hoped the West might be different. But wide country meant nothing if hearts stayed narrow. That evening the church gathered. Amara, as she always did, came to help, bringing small robes she had sewn for the children. The moment she stepped in, she felt the shift. Murmurs dulled, eyes slid over her, then turned away. Her pulse stumbled, her feet wanted to halt. Isaiah appeared from the rear, tall frame casting a long shadow across the boards. He strode straight to a pew, sat, and did not flinch. His presence alone stilled some of the whispering. From the pulpit, the minister droned on about charity. Yet, when his gaze swept briefly toward Amara, his brow tightened. After service, while folks lingered on the steps, he approached. His voice was low, but pitched just loud enough for others to hear. "Boone, you know this isn't right. A widower has no business sheltering a strange woman in his home, especially." His eyes flicked to Amara, "especially one like her." The air pressed close. Some nodded, others smirked. Amara's heart plunged as if the ground had vanished beneath her. She turned to leave, but Isaiah's voice rose, low and grave-edged, yet cutting clear. "She has a name, Amara Johnson, and she deserves to be called by it, nothing less." Silence hushed the yard. The minister faltered, lips parting. Isaiah stepped closer, his stance unyielding. "My house is mine. Who I let in is my choice. If it offends you, don't look." Amara froze, her hand, trembling, reached for the rough fabric of his sleeve. She feared he might shake her off. He did not. He let it rest, his arm steady as stone, giving her the shelter she had never dared dream. The minister hesitated, glanced at the crowd for support. But the people only stood quiet. Some eyes still sneered, others faltered, uneasy. Isaiah held his hat tight, steel gray eyes fixed on the minister. "I've buried enough in my life. I won't let anyone bury another with their words." No reply came. The minister pressed his lips thin, turned, and walked away. The crowd dissolved. Amara remained at his side, hand still on his arm. Only when he looked down did she startle and pull away. Heat rose to her cheeks, but his eyes held no rebuke, only stillness, as if he understood more than she could say. On the walk back, wind tugged her hair, sharp with cold, but inside she felt an unfamiliar warmth. The slurs would not vanish overnight. Yet the sight of Isaiah standing in open defense of her before the whole town had planted a fragile seed of hope. For the first time she knew she was not fighting this battle alone. And for the first time his gaze when it turned to her carried something more than the silence of a lonely man. It held recognition, presence like a thin but steady cord stretched between two wounded souls. That night, the air lay still, broken only by the rasp of crickets across the open fields. Inside the cabin, firelight painted the wooden ceiling in shades of red. Amara sat on the long bench, her dark dress draping over her narrow legs. In her hands, a needle clicked through cloth, each stitch marking time like the steady tap of a clock. Isaiah sat across from her, back against the table, a bottle of whiskey unopened at his side. He didn't touch it. His gaze stayed fixed on the flames, the way a man might stare into a bottomless ravine, still waited, unyielding. The silence grew so thick Amara felt she might cut it with words. Yet when she looked up and caught his eyes, the urge softened. Those eyes carried something nameless, a grief not dulled by years. At last, she set her sewing aside. Her voice was low, but firm. "In Kansas, I worked at a white man's tailor shop. He gave me a wage, but never respect. Once he called me out before a store full of customers, made me kneel to gather scraps off the floor, and told me that was where I belonged, not behind his cutting table." The fire flared, echoing the tremor in her tone. Amara bit her lip, staring at her calloused hands. "That day, I swore no one would ever make me small again. But her breath caught here in dust water. When I hear what they say, it feels like I'm back there all over." Isaiah didn't interrupt. He offered no pity. He only watched her, steady, giving her the rare weight of being truly heard. Not as a stranger, but as a whole soul. After a long moment, he shifted his chair closer. His voice, gravel deep, rolled like wind against stone. "I once had a family. A wife and a boy." Amara raised her eyes. Isaiah swallowed hard, his large hands knotting together. 3 winters back, we were coming home from a long trip. Hail fell, the road slick. I pushed the team to make it before dark. The wheels skidded. The horses panicked. He stopped. Eyes squeezed shut as if the memory still blazed in front of him. I woke under the storm. They never opened their eyes again. Her chest constricted. Words rose, but none could carry the weight of his pain. Only silence could honor it. Isaiah turned, opened a drawer, and lifted a small wooden box. Inside lay a few relics, a scuffed silver ring, a child's worn Bible, and a hand-stitched cloth. The stitching was simple, the pattern plain yet gentle. He held the cloth a long moment, then crossed to her side. Slowly he opened his palm and set it in hers. "She sweat this in her last winter," he said, his voice frayed. "I let it sit there for years, gathering dust," but his gaze locked with hers. "It belongs with you now more than it does shut away in wood." Amara froze. The threads felt soft against her skin, but his eyes bore heavier than the gift itself, confessing that her presence had not only filled an empty cabin, but had begun to reach the hollow in his heart. Her throat tightened, tears rising. She nodded, clutching the cloth like something precious. The space between them had never felt so close. The fire still burned, but its warmth was different now. In that quiet moment, Amara and Isaiah both knew, though no words were spoken, that they had placed the rawest parts of their wounds into each other's hands. And from that, something new was stirring to life. Snow had fallen all afternoon, and by night it had grown into a true storm. The wind howled across the fields, slamming sheets of white against the cabin walls until they shuddered on their foundation. Inside, the fire roared bright, its red glow dancing across the wooden walls. Yet the warmth could not fully drive out the cold, creeping through every crack. Amara sat curled on the long bench. Isaiah's late wife's embroidered cloth folded in her lap. She tried to push her needle through a few more stitches, but her hands shook too badly to hold it steady. Firelight traced her face, deepening her brown eyes with fatigue and something unspoken. Isaiah sat near, broad shoulders cut in flamed shadow. He looked to the window where snow pressed like a white wall, then back to his calloused hands resting heavy on his knees. No words, only the storm gnashing against wood. Amara lifted her gaze, voice low, woven with the wind. "In moments like this, I think of Kansas, though I'd rather forget it. At least there. I didn't fear vanishing in a town that refuses to see me." Isaiah turned, his eyes darkening. After a pause, his reply came rough, rasped as if pulled from stone. "You're not invisible." "Not here," she stilled. In his gaze, she saw something beyond the usual silence, a fire buried too long, waiting for the faintest breath to rise. She held her hands over the blaze. But when Isaiah placed a cup of hot water in her grasp, his fingers lingered against hers. The touch held a moment longer than courtesy would allow. Her pulse raced, breath tangled. She looked up and his eyes met hers. This was no longer the look of a host toward a guest. It was the look of a man who had dwelt too long with shadows, and now found an unlooked for refuge. Words caught in her throat. Isaiah leaned closer, his rough hand brushing her hair. His fingers moved slow down the braid at her neck, careful, almost reverent, yet carrying a hunger he could no longer hide. Their breaths mingled. Amara trembled, but did not pull away. She tilted her head, closing the distance until the space between them was filled only by the sound of two hearts pounding louder than the storm outside. Their lips met, tentative at first, questioning if it could be real. Then the dam broke. The kiss deepened, fierce and long suppressed, carrying years of silence and yearning. Isaiah drew her close, his arms banding tight, strong enough to make her feel she might dissolve within them. She answered in kind, her small hands clutching his shoulders, her body shivering not from the cold, but from the rush of release. They sank together onto the blanket before the fire. Outside the blizzard shrieked, but within the cabin only breath and heartbeat remained, tangled into one rhythm. His hands traced the curve of her while her lips pressed against the scars on his chest, as if her tenderness could soften the weight of every wound he carried. That night, no vows were spoken, but every touch, every look, every breath became a silent promise. It was not merely the easing of loneliness, but the confession that they had chosen one another against storm, against silence, against all the world. As the fire burned low, Amara curled within Isaiah's arms. Her head rested against his chest, the heavy drum of his heart steady beneath her ear. For the first time in years, she felt herself belong, not to a place, but to a person. The blizzard raged on outside, but inside the cabin, warmth held fast, driving back the dark. In her drifting half-leap, Amara smiled. In December, Dustwater held its winter festival, one of the rare nights when the whole town left their shuttered homes. A tall pine was raised in the square, oil lamps strung around it, children darting through the snow, banjo music mingling with laughter in the frozen air. Amara walked beside Isaiah, her heart caught between wonder and unease. This was the first time she had stood openly at his side since the night of the storm, and his presence alone was enough to turn heads. Isaiah said nothing, only kept his slow stride beside her, his steady hand resting lightly against her back, a silent claim. Amara lifted her chin, though she could feel the murmurs trailing behind. The chatter hushed when a figure stepped from the crowd. Clayton Harris, dressed in a deep blue wool coat, a bright red scarf stark against the drifting snow. He came forward, pale eyes glinting with the same arrogance Amara remembered from Kansas. "Amara Johnson," Clayton called loud enough for all to hear. "Never thought I'd find you in a forsaken place like this." Amara froze, memories flooding back. His visits to the tailor shop, his honeyed lies, and the venomous rumors he spread when she turned him away. Clayton's gaze slid to Isaiah, his mouth curling. So this is how she survives, clinging to a widower or twice her age. Folks ought to know. Back in Kansas, no man would touch her. They said she was barren, living off pity. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some laughed, others looked away. Amara felt the blood drain from her face. Her chest clench as if the old whip cracked across her skin again. Isaiah stepped forward, his broad frame casting shadow over her. His eyes flashed still, his voice deep and sharp enough to cut through the laughter. "Enough, Harris." Clayton's brow arched, sneer curling deeper. "I'm only telling the truth. A man like you deserves better than." He never finished. Isaiah's fist struck hard, the crack echoing across the square. Clayton fell back into the snow, blood marking his lip. The lamps trembled on their hooks as the crowd drew in breath. Silence fell, heavy as stone. Isaiah stood tall, fists still clenched, chest rising. He spoke no further, but the look he leveled on Clayton warned every man within sight. Amara's hand trembled. Without thought, she touched his arm, feeling the muscle taut beneath his shirt. That slight contact carried his strength into her shaking bones. Isaiah did not shake her off. He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes, and the cold in his gaze softened. Clayton struggled up, his face twisted. "You'll regret this, Boone." "I'll not forget it." No one answered. The crowd parted, letting him storm away. The whispers that followed were different now. Some faces still hardened with judgment, but others carried hesitation, even respect. Amara drew a deep breath, her hands still resting on Isaiah's arm as though clinging to the one pillar that held her upright. In the bite of winter wind and the faint echo of music, she understood. Her past was no longer hers to bear alone. He had taken it with her into the open before them all. And when Isaiah laid his broad hand over hers, giving it the slightest press, Amara felt her heart shift. No longer guarded, no longer shut. It opened, ready to receive the man who stood before a crowd and spoke her name as the only truth he would acknowledge. That winter carried more than bitter wind. It brought a danger greater than any blizzard. One morning while Amara hauled water from the well behind the cabin, the pastor's wife came running, breath ragged. "Amara, the railroad men are in town. They're at the saloon and Clayton Harris is with them." The news spread like wildfire. By noon, Isaiah pulled on his heavy coat, saddled his horse. Amara insisted on going with him. Through the swirl of snow, they rode into the center of Dustwater where a crowd had gathered before the saloon. 3 strangers in black coats stood there, badges pinned to their chests, crossed rails gleaming on metal. Clayton stood at their side, his smile sharp as a knife. When he spotted Isaiah and Amara, he clapped his hands together, raising his voice for all to hear. "Boone, just the man we wanted. Fortune smiles on you. Your land lies square on the line we aim to build. The railroad will pay you more money than you've ever dreamed. The crowd buzzed. The some Clayton name drew gasps, faces lit with hunger, money that could turn dust water rich, open saloons, buy herds, send children away to school. Isaiah's hand tightened on the res, his eyes cold steel. I'm not selling. The lead railroad man arched a brow. Mr. Boone, we seek no quarrel, but the line will run through with or without you. Sell and you'll be wealthy. Refuse and you'll find only trouble. Clayton slid in, voice slick with false sweetness. Think on it, Boone. This is your chance to matter. You're an old widower who took in a woman nobody else wanted. Do you really think you'll hold this land forever? The words stung hot as brand iron. Amara stepped forward, facing them square. Her voice rang, not loud, but firm enough to cut the air. Some things cannot be bought. This land, this home, it holds memory. It is where we've rebuilt our lives. Your money can't buy that. Silence fell. Some dropped their gaze. Others snorted. A cattleman broke it with a bark. Fine talk, but that money could feed this whole town. We've been poor too long. Another voice rose in answer. If Boone loses his land, Dustwater loses its soul. No one will dare stand against the railroad again. The square erupted in argument. Half cried to sell, half stood quiet, but with eyes turned toward Isaiah and Amara in quiet solidarity. The air cracked with division as though the ground itself split beneath them. Isaiah did not argue. He simply stepped forward, standing beside Amara. His hand settled firm against her back, steady as a pillar. His eyes locked on the railroad man. You heard her. We're not selling. Clayton gave a short, bitter laugh, tugging his red scarf tight. So be it. But don't weep when spring comes and you find a train barreling straight through your fence line. The crowd drifted off, leaving a chill sharper than the wind. Amara clenched her fists, but felt Isaiah's shoulder close to him, hers, the one wall still standing against the storm. That night, while the wind howled, Amara sat before the fire, her eyes bright as coals. She knew Clayton would not stop. Yet for the first time, fear was not all she felt. There was something stronger. Faith. Faith that beside Isaiah she could not be bought, could not be shamed, and would not be erased from this life. The storm came without warning, rolling across the prairie like a white wall of fury. For days the wind screamed, rattling every cabin roof, piling snow high against fences, burying the land in a deadly white hush. Inside Isaiah Boone's small house, the hearth fire never dimmed. Amara fed it log by log, her hands cracked and raw, her arms trembling from labor. The storm outside was merciless, yet still weaker than the fever-consuming Isaiah. It began with a shiver, his shoulders shaking as he carried wood in from the yard. By nightfall, his face was pale, sweat pouring through. The room was cold as stone. Amara touched his brow and recoiled the heat of fire. She eased him onto the bed, covering him with every blanket in the house, praying the fever would pass quicker than the storm. But it did not break. It climbed. By the second day, Isaiah could no longer rise. His breath came rough. His lips muttered fragments, names, prayers, broken apologies. The man, once steady as a timber, now lay fragile, and for the first time since she had met him, Amara feared he might slip away. She refused to leave. Each morning she boiled water, brewed weak tea, trickled drops against his cracked lips. She pressed cool cloths to his brow, wrung sweat from his blankets, and called his name whenever he sank too deep into fever's grip. Her eyes burned red from sleepless nights. Her skin split raw from cold, leaking through the walls, yet she clung to his hand as if her grip tethered him to life. On the fourth night, Isaiah writhed in nightmare. He cried again and again of the wagon sliding on ice, of screams cut short. Amara knew he was reliving the night he lost his wife and child. She seized his shoulders, her voice low and fierce. You're here. You're not alone. Come back. She repeated it over and over until his thrashing eased and his breathing slowed. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her hands never let go. Time blurred. The storm sealed the cabin tight, leaving only the snap of wood and the rasp of his breath. Amara no longer measured hours by clocks, but by the rise and fall of heat on his skin. Hope would flicker when it cooled, only to die when it flared hotter still. By the 6th day, she was near collapse. Her body swayed when she stood, the world tilting. Yet whenever he moaned, strength surged back. She sat by his side, brushed the wet hair from his brow, pressed her forehead to his hand. You have to fight, not for this land. Not for pride, for us. For what we could be. The words startled her as they left her lips, but she knew they were true. That night, the fever burned highest. His face glowed red in the firelight, his breath ragged. Amara trembled with fear. She clutched his hand and wept aloud. Don't leave me, Isaiah. Not now. Not after you've shown me what it is to be seen. She pressed his hand to her chest as if her heartbeat could anchor him. At dawn, his fingers twitched. She thought herself delirious. Then his hand closed faintly around hers. She gasped, bent close. Isaiah, I'm here. Come back. His ash-gray eyes cracked open, dim with exhaustion, but clear enough to know her. His lips rasped one word. Amara. Her whole body broke open. Laughter and sobs tangled. She pressed his hand to her cheek. You came back. You truly came back to me. From then on, every spoonful of broth he swallowed, every steadier breath felt like a miracle. Amara propped him with pillows, wiped sweat from his temples, and worked in silence. Her hands always busy, pulling covers close, smoothing his hair, touching his fingers so he knew he was not alone. For the first time, Isaiah let another care for him, let himself lean on her gentleness. Amara marked each day with small cuts on a log. She forced herself to eat scraps of bread, though every bite felt bitter. When her hands shook too much to sew, she sang the hymns her mother once taught. Voice cracked, but steady enough to lay a second blanket over him in sound. Sometimes in fever, he whispered, "Don't take the boy." And she wept, gripping his hand, whispering comfort. Other times, "My fault." And she answered firm, "No, you lived because you had to, because someone is waiting." On the 7th night, she dreamed. He walked away into the storm, his figure fading. She cried out, woke to find his weary eyes open, fixed on her. That fragile gaze gave her strength until dawn broke, and the fever broke with it. By the 8th day, as she dozed by his bed, a rough hand moved through her hair. She startled awake, met his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. His lips shaped the words, faint but sure. "You saved me." Tears slipped free, but she shook her head, smiling through the ache. "We saved each other." Outside, the storm had passed. Pale sunlight fell across the white fields. Inside, warmth returned. Isaiah slept in peace, his hands still clasped in hers. Together they had walked the edge of death. Their bond tested in fire. No vow had been spoken, but 8 long days had bound them truer than any ring. One holding on, the other fighting back. For the first time since leaving Kansas, Amara closed her eyes and dared to dream of tomorrow. The harsh winter passed, leaving its scars on roofs, fences, and Isaiah's body. But as the snow melted, the prairie bloomed with patches of green, and life's breath returned to the small cabin. For Amara, that spring was more than the land's renewal. It was their own. Two people who had walked to the edge of death and returned together. Isaiah healed slowly, but with each day he grew steadier. At first, it was only bracing himself to sit, then a few careful steps around the cabin. Amara never strayed far. Whenever pain drew lines on his face, she caught his arm, her eyes steady and gentle, reminding him he was no longer fighting alone. As strength returned, Isaiah turned to the promise he had whispered through winter nights to expand the house. He wanted more than a shelter. He wanted a home for them both. With calloused hands, he built a new room, its floor firm, its window opening toward the plains. It would be Amara's sewing room, a place for her craft. And his way of proving her place here was permanent. Amara's chest swelled when she first stepped inside. The scent of new timber lingered. Sunlight poured through the frame. On the table stood a long bench and a sewing stand Isaiah had made himself. Clumsy but strong. "So you don't have to bend your back anymore," he said. Voice low, eyes bright. Amara wrapped her arms around him, pressed her cheek to his shoulder. In that moment she felt every rejection of her past stitching closed. Word of the workshop spread quickly. At first folks stayed wary. Dustwater had once whispered about her had spat the Negro woman living with that widower outer. But the sight of Isaiah surviving fever with Amara steadfast at his side planted a respect that could not be denied. Spring brought a small fair. Townsfolk laid out goods to trade. Amara sat down a few simple things, embroidered handkerchiefs, children's dresses. No one spoke at first, though glances darted her way. Then came a woman Amara remembered too well, the same who had scorned her outside the church. She held a roll of pale blue cloth, her step slow, voice quiet, but clear. "Miss Johnson, I need a dress for my daughter. I hear your stitching is strong. Could you?" Amara froze. The sting of old words returned, but she drew breath and nodded. "I will." Her hands trembled as she took the cloth, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. No apology was needed. The act itself was admission enough. The town was beginning to see her differently. Soon others followed, a coat to mend, a quilt to patch. The hum of needle and thread became a new rhythm in the wooden room, and each time a child laughed in a fresh dress. Amara's heart blossomed. Isaiah too was seen anew. No longer only the brooding widower outer, but a man who had risen after loss, rebuilding life with hands and heart. With Amara, he stood as proof that resilience and love could remake what grief had shattered. Some evenings when work was done, they sat together on the porch, gazing at sunlit fields. The spring wind carried the scent of wet earth and the songs of birds. Amara leaned into Isaiah's shoulder, his broad hand covering hers. No words were needed. Both knew winter had tested them, and spring was their reward. One night, sewing by lamplight, Amara remembered Kansas, where she had been told she wasn't fit to touch fine cloth. Now that same voice had brought her fabric to craft a dress for her child. Tears welled, dripping onto the fabric in her lap. From across the room, Isaiah watched, then rose without a word, resting his solid hand on her shoulder. That touch said enough. The old wounds no longer ruled her. That spring, Dustwater shifted. The town was no paradise. Yet Amara and Isaiah's presence had SWN a seed. Whispers waned. In their place came longer looks, careful listening. From scorned outsider, Amara grew into a figure other women quietly admired. Proof that contempt did not demand surrender. On Sunday, as church bells rang, Amara sat in the middle pew. No eyes turned away. And when Isaiah reached for her hand before them all, no voice objected. Instead, a few heads nodded, a few lips curved into faint smiles. It was a beginning, not only for them, but for the whole town. Above the sewing room door, Isaiah hung a hand-carved sign. "Where hands find worth and hearts find home." Each time Amara read it, her throat burned. She was no longer cast aside. She was part of the town, of the house of the man who had chosen her. That spring, renewal came not only in green shoots across the prairie, but in the way human eyes began to change. And for the first time in her life, Amara felt truly seen. Summer came, carrying fresh breath into Dustwater. The prairie stretched deep green, wildflowers blazing bright along the roadside, and the little town stirred with the sound of wagons and hoofbeats more than before. Amara sat at her sewing bench in the new workshop, needle flashing in the morning light that softened her face. Outside the window, Isaiah worked on the fence, tall and steady, as rooted as the land itself. One noon, with the sun beating down on the roof, a young family arrived. A husband, wife, and their little girl, no more than 3. They came on foot, their worldly goods packed into a battered pram and a couple of bags. Faces worn thin by travel, yet their eyes carried a spark of hope. The husband, once a miner, spoke softly. We heard tell there's a couple here who stood against storm and railroad both. We lost our work, lost our home. We've nowhere else to turn. We're just hoping for a place to begin again. Amara and Isaiah shared a look. In his eyes, Amara saw the reflection of her first days in Dustwater. The scorn, the whispered cruelty, the sting of being cast aside. Now another family stood before them, carrying that same despair. Isaiah laid a hand on the young man's shoulder, voice low but firm. Stay here. We'll raise another cabin alongside the shop. Amara knelt to greet the little girl, offering her a handkerchief embroidered with daisies. Here, no one begins again alone. Their story unfolded like an open wound. The husband told of the hell in a mine collapse that had taken so many lives. The company cast him aside. His family forced from their quarters. The wife, eyes glistening, whispered. We knocked on so many doors, but each one closed when they saw our skin, our rags. Amara felt her chest tighten. It was as though her own past rose up to meet her. She touched the woman's shoulder, her hand a quiet vow. I know. In the days that followed, Amara and Isaiah shared food, taught the young man to mend fence, the young woman to stitch cloth. The child's laughter rang through the yard, washing away shadows. In the wife's eyes, Amara glimpsed her own reflection, the same fear of abandonment, the same fragile hope of belonging. Word of their kindness spread through Dustwater. Folks who once sneered fell silent. Some even knocked at the cabin door, bringing flour, fabric, or a few coins for the new family. Not all hearts changed, but each nod, each offering marked a shift in the town's soul. One morning, Amara sat by her workshop window, sunlight spilling across the boards. She thought of Kansas, how it had nearly broken her. If she had yielded, then there would be no today. And now, with another family at her door, she could open her arms instead of closing them. Isaiah stepped in, setting a steaming cup of tea beside her. He said nothing, only looked where she looked, then laid a steady hand on her shoulder, a silent agreement. That evening they sat on the porch watching the calm little girl chase weeds in the grass. The sun sank red over the horizon, shadows gathering. Amara leaned into Isaiah's shoulder, whispering, right here. His arm tightened, etching truth into his bones. Home was not timber walls, but the presence of one another. Later that night, before sleep, Amara slipped a note into the drawer. If anyone asks where my home is, I will answer. It is where arms hold me when I tremble, where eyes look on me without judgment, where someone chooses to stay. Right here, Dustwater still held trials ahead. The railroad might press, outsiders might covet, but to Amara, home was no longer a cabin or a patch of land. Home was this arm around her, this man who had chosen to remain. As lamplight glowed and night drew near, Amara looked around. The little girl sleeping in her mother's arms, the young couple smiling despite weariness, Isaiah's hand clasping hers, a truth settled in her heart, clear as carved in stone. Home is not a place. Home is the people who choose to stay. Amara and Isaiah's tale did not close with music or gold, nor with triumphs writ large. It closed with a quiet evening, sun sinking behind low hills. Two souls weathered by loss, still standing together on the porch, breathing as one. They began in suspicion, in cruel whispers, in loneliness that seemed without end. Yet season by season through love and endurance they turned wounds into foundation, rejection into welcome. From cast-offs they became a beacon for the lost. From slander they built a legacy of kindness and an unyielding handclasp beneath winter storms. For many of us, especially with hair gone silver, such a story stirs memories. Times when we were left behind. Times we thought there was no place for us. And yet somehow we found an arm, an eye, a soul that chose to remain. That is home. Not shingles, not walls, but people who see us with respect and love. When Amara whispered, right here, she spoke not only to Isaiah, but to all of us. Here, where love abides, where choice is honored, where trust outlasts prejudice. And it is reminder enough, no matter the storm, what endures is the one who stays by our side. If this story touched your heart, Share your thoughts with us. Have you had a right here in your life, a place, a person that proved you were never alone? We would be honored to hear. Each memory is a gift. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so that any soul feeling lost might find hope again. And to those of you seasoned by years, may this story be like a warm cup of tea in the dusk. Gentle, steady, reminding you that love, choice, and home remain. Friends, let us hold on to that echo. For in the end, our lives may run long or short, but the moment someone clasps our hand and whispers, "Right here," that is the part of life that is whole.